Good day. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Douglas Harder, and in this topic, we're going to define real finite dimensional vectors. So in this topic, we will revisit two-dimensional vectors, then three-dimensional vectors, and then introduce n-dimensional vectors. We will then describe representations and introduce notations such as r squared, r cubed, and r to the n. Now, a two-dimensional real vector is an ordered pair of real numbers. So here u is equal to the vector u sub 1, u sub 2. If a vector is going to be represented by a variable, that variable will be lowercase and it will be boldface and Roman, meaning upright and not italicized. The entries of a vector, in this case u1 and u2, are the corresponding italicized letters. So if boldface u is the vector, the entries are italicized u sub 1 and italicized u sub 2. These are again assumed to be real numbers. So, for example, here u sub 1 is 3.75 and u sub 2 is negative 2.54. Here the vector v has entries v sub 1, which is 8.29, and v sub 2 equaling 1.52. Sometimes we may just write down a numeric vector without giving it a name. So here we have a vector with two entries in it. Now note, the order of the entries of a vector is relevant. For example, these two vectors, even though they contain the same entries, are distinct and different from each other, as the first entries are not equal and the second entries are not equal either. So consequently, order does matter for vectors. And now recall that boldface r represents the set of all real numbers. We are going to represent the set of all two-dimensional real vectors with boldface r squared. So if u is a two-dimensional vector, we can write u an element of r squared, which is usually read as u is in the set r squared. The symbol that looks sort of like an E says that u is an element of, but it can also be read as u is in the set. Alternatively, we may simply say or read this as u is a two-dimensional real vector. Now note that this vector here, it has the entry 3.72 and then the second entry is infinity. This is not a real two-dimensional vector. It's not in r squared because infinity is not a real number. Now, a three-dimensional real vector is an ordered triplet of real numbers. So the order matters. Here the entries u1, u2, and u3 are assumed to be real. And if the vector is written as a boldface w, then the entries are, again, three real values, w sub 1, w sub 2, w sub 3. So here are some examples. Here's another example. And we are going to represent the set of all three-dimensional real vectors with uppercase r cubed. So once again, we may write v is an element of r cubed, which is also read as v is in the set r cubed, or something like that. Alternatively, we may simply say or read this as v is a three-dimensional real vector. Now, why stop at 3? Could I not have an ordered sequence of n real numbers and label it as u? Here, all n entries, u1 through u sub n, are assumed to be real numbers. Notice you can say u1 or sometimes you may say u sub 1. It doesn't matter. We are going to represent all n-dimensional real vectors by a bold-faced capital R raised to the power n. And we will say w is an element of r to the n as w is in the set of r to the n, or w is an element of r to the n, or alternatively just w is an n-dimensional real vector. Here are some examples. First, we see a vector here with the entries 1.2 through 9.5, and that is in the set rq to the power 5, or r to the 5. Next, we see an 8-dimensional vector having entries 3.0, 5.4, all the way down to negative 0.5. If we have 4 vectors in r to the 5, we may actually label these vectors with subscripts. Well, in that case, you may ask, what are the entries of those vectors? Well, the entry of the vector v sub k will be the real numbers v sub k1, v sub k2 through v sub k5. Or alternatively, we can write the vector v sub k as this column of 5 entries. And this would be true for each of the values of k, 1 through, in this case, 4. Now, if v is a handwritten vector, it will be shown with an arrow above the letter, and the entries cannot be or will not be italicized. So, for example, if I was writing this on the board, v would have an arrow above it while the entries would not. They would simply have subscripts. And so if there is no subscript, it's assumed to be a real, or if there's no arrow above it, it's assumed to be a real value. So in this topic, you now know that an n-dimensional real vector has n ordered values. You know that the set of all n-dimensional vectors is represented by r to the n, and you understand that if v is a vector in r to the n, then the entries are v sub 1 through v sub n. Again, n can be any positive integer. Now, you may be frustrated that vectors are represented by columns, but this is an absolute necessity, so please use it. Here's the references, acknowledgements, the colophon, and a disclaimer. Cheers!